The Trojan Saga, Part 1. The Trojan Saga covers the period of the Trojan War, which was the greatest conflict that the Greeks ever experienced. Historically, we know that the Greeks probably gathered together in late 13th, early 12th century, and they went to Troy, which is in Asia Minor, modern Turkey, and they fought a pretty important war with the city there, overcame that city, and destroyed it. Now, the conflict itself was so big that it lived forever in the Greek consciousness, in their imagination. And the great works of ancient epic, the greatest works of ancient epic, the Iliad, the Odyssey, and even the Aeneid, which is a Roman epic, deal with either the conflict or the aftermath of the conflict. The story of the Trojan War has its roots in the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Thetis was a nymph, and as a beautiful nymph, of course, Zeus took a liking to her. But there was a prophecy that she was destined to bear a child who would be greater than his father. Well, Zeus was too smart to fall for this, so instead of getting involved with her himself, he decided to find her a mortal husband, and he did, the young hero Peleus, who was one of the Argonauts, who we'll talk about later. And so they had a wedding, and this is one of the great events of mythology as well, because all the gods and goddesses were invited. Everyone came, and it was a big party. Everyone, of course, except Eris, who is the god of discord. Nobody invited her, because she's always causing problems. Well, since she's always causing problems, you can be sure she was going to cause a problem here. And since she wasn't invited, she decided to get her revenge. And she created a golden apple, and she wrote on it, "For the most beautiful," and then she threw it into the middle of the wedding party. Well, when a golden apple shows up in the midst of a bunch of goddesses and is for the most beautiful, you can bet there's going to be some conflict. Immediately, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite all claim it for themselves as being the most beautiful. So there they are, the three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, all claiming to be the most beautiful. And whom should they turn to except Zeus to render a judgment on this? Zeus the wise, Zeus father of gods and men, Zeus the all-knowing, all-seeing, and Zeus the far too smart to fall for this trap. So he does what he would normally do in this situation. He finds a poor, hapless, witless mortal to stand in for him. So he sends a messenger out to a hilltop where he finds Paris, who is a shepherd. Now, Paris was the son of Priam and Hecuba, king and queen of Troy, but there was a prophecy that he was going to bring destruction upon his city, so they abandon him. He then grows up in a shepherd family and becomes a shepherd. And, of course, no one can escape the will of the gods or the fates. So there he is on top of the hill, and the goddesses show up, and he has to judge between them. Well, Paris, showing that he's witless, takes this as a golden opportunity to have a little fun with them. So he makes them all strip in front of them so he can get a good eye, a good look at them, and he makes them twirl and do all sorts of things that you would do in a beauty contest. And of course, they all try to bribe him. Hera offers him great royal power, Athena, victory and renown in war, and Aphrodite, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Obviously, he chooses Aphrodite. We know where the story goes. He takes the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. But myself, I don't think the bribe was a factor, because when it comes down to it, if you're choosing between the mother, a warrior, and the goddess of love, really there probably is only one. There probably is only one answer here. I'm going to go ahead and go out on the limb and say Aphrodite certainly was the most beautiful of these. And so, bribes aside, he chose correctly. Of course, this doesn't make Hera and Athena happy, and they go away very angry, and Zeus goes away relieved that he didn't have to choose between his wife and his two beautiful daughters. So what about Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world at her time? Well, she is the child of Leda. Now, Leda was married to Tyndareus, and on one night, Leda and Tyndareus had marital relations. They had sex, and she was pregnant. But on the same night, Zeus, who has always had an eye for beautiful women, saw Leda also. He fell madly in love with her, at least for the night, and instead of approaching her directly as he has so many other times, this time he approaches an animal, as he does in other times. He appears in the form of a swan, and He seduces her, or rapes her, depending on the story. And this is a subject that the ancients like portraying sometimes, not in massive sculptures, but at least in smaller representations. You can see the picture right there. Very, very, very strange story, but par for Zeus. In any event, because she had sex with two different men on the same night, she conceived from both. Clytemnestra and Castor, then, were the products of Leda and Tyndareus, and as such they were mortal. Leda and Zeus, on the other hand, produced Helen and Polydeuces, so twin sister and brother, and they were the part immortal. Some stories, actually, she laid eggs, and they were born from those eggs because she had had sex with the swan. In any event, Helen, most beautiful woman in the world, is the product of Leda, the mortal, and Zeus, the god. Since we've already talked about the house of Atreus, doubtless you remember that Helen was in fact married to Menelaus, and they were the king and queen of Sparta. They also had a child, a young girl named Hermione. Well, unfortunately, being married doesn't protect you from the love or whims of the gods, and so since she had been promised to Paris by Aphrodite, she would of course be his prize. Paris knew this, and he went there in search of her. Now Paris, who's also called Alexander, went to Sparta, and he convinced her to go with him, or he kidnapped her, took her away in the night. The story could go either way. In any event, most of the stories, they do run off together, and they fall in love, and it's a passionate love affair, and you get the feeling that she never really liked Menelaus. In one sense, you have to have a certain amount of sympathy for Helen, or I always do, because she's not really in control of the actions around her, and she can't help how she looks. She was kidnapped by Theseus at one point, and then she's taken away by Paris. Men are always falling around all over her, and she's just kind of in the middle of it. Of course, that's not to say that she doesn't take advantage of the situation, but still, there's a certain amount of sympathy that I've always had for her situation. Now, some Greeks didn't even think that she went, that she remained chaste the entire time, and what happened is that Zeus created a likeness of her that went to Troy, and then she herself was whisked away to Egypt. And while she was there, she just stayed there for the entire war, and then Menelaus rescued her at the end. So she never did turn her back on him or her family. Part of that is because in the 5th century, a lot of Greeks had problems thinking that an entire war of this magnitude could start because one woman left her husband. Thucydides in particular thinks, yeah, this doesn't really make sense. We'll see that Euripides has trouble with it. But that makes mythology that's maybe not as interesting. So for us, the official story is the one we'll go with, and it's the one that Homer's happy with, and the one that I'm happy with, is that she actually did fall in love with Paris, and they ran off together, and this set about this chain of events that leads to the fall of Troy. Troy itself was a great city in Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, and the king at this time was a man named Priam. Now, Priam, king of Troy, had 50 sons and 12 daughters, and a number of wives. The two most prominent Trojans were Paris and his brother Hector. Paris had the favor of Aphrodite and was a skilled archer, which will come into play later in the story. Hector is the greatest champion of all the Trojans, the only one who's even close to being able to stand up to Achilles. He's married to Andromache, and they have a child named Astyanax, and often they're juxtaposed in mythology and Homer with Paris and Helen. Whereas Paris and Helen are the young lovers, and they have kind of a troubled, illicit relationship, Hector and Andromache have a marriage that looks very much like you would expect or even want a marriage to be today. There's a great deal of equality between them, and there's a great deal of love between them. He honestly has affection for his wife, and he loves his child. And so we see their match together as something that the Greeks certainly appreciated and valued, and something that has been, I guess, a constant theme in the best kind of marriage that could be, even though there is tragedy underlying it, because of course we know how the story ends. The most important daughter of Priam is Cassandra, and you probably remember Cassandra because she was the one who Apollo had fallen in love with, and he promised her the gift of prophecy if she would consent to have sex with him. She did consent, he gave her the gift of prophecy, and then she backed out of the deal, and she refused to sleep with him at that point. Now, he couldn't take back the gift he had given, but he did make sure that no one would ever believe her. So she has the gift of prophecy with the curse of never being believed. Polyxena is another daughter of Priam, and at the end of the war, she is taken by the Greeks and they sacrifice her on the grave of Achilles. Another of the most important Trojans is Aeneas, who's the son of Anchises and Aphrodite, and we remember them from earlier stories we've seen. He is a survivor of Troy. He escapes with his father and his son, and eventually wanders through the Mediterranean world until he lands in Italy and becomes the father of the Roman people. Antenor is one who was opposed to the war the entire time. He always wanted to give Helen back. And since the Greeks knew this, after the war, they don't kill him. They let him leave, and he flees to Italy, and he becomes the founder of Padua. Glaucus isn't a particularly important character, but he is featured in an interesting episode. He's the leader of the Lycians, and he's the guest friend of Diomedes. And how this works out is that they find each other on the line, and they're fighting, and then Homeric heroes always announce who they are, and they give a little speech about who they are and what their family lineage is, and what makes them heroes, and what gives them the right to fight there. And then the other one does, and then all of a sudden they realize they're guest friends. And they say, well, if you're a guest friend, I'm a guest friend. Our grandparents knew each other. We can't fight. We need to find other lines to fight in. And so they actually leave each other. They break off the combat before it started, and they find other places to fight. Eventually, Glaucus is killed by Ajax. But what I find interesting is it helps us understand the nature of the guest friend relationship and how long those ties actually last and the value that people placed on them. Sarpedon was son of Zeus and Laodamia. Now he's also not particularly important for the story, but there is a really interesting episode with him, and when he's fated to die, Zeus wants to save him, and the other gods say you can't do this because every god has children down there fighting. And even though you may love your child, it's no reason to circumvene fate. And so Zeus has to stand with the scales of fate balancing over the battle that Sarpedon's in, and he has to watch his own son die. And then he sends gods down, as you can see in the picture, to take care of him, to make sure that his body isn't despoiled. Among some of the most important allies of the Trojans were Memnon, who was king of the Ethiopians, and he brought a troop there. Great warrior, but was killed by Achilles. Penthesilea, another of the Trojan allies, was queen of the Amazons, and she fought and killed a great many Greeks also, until she was eventually killed by Achilles. One of the stories is that he fell in love with her after he had killed her and possibly violated her dead body, although not everyone accepts that story. This ends the lecture. Next, we'll continue our discussion of the Trojan War.